Good morning. I'm Don Palmer. I'm a commissioner with the Election Assistance Commission. We're going to focus on the efforts of the Wisconsin National Guard and the Wisconsin Elections Commission and their administrator, Meagan, Wolfe, in the recent special elections and the April general election. My guests today are Brigadier General Robyn Blader and Wisconsin Election Administrator Meagan Wolfe. I'd like to talk to you before we get started and give a little bit more background on their bios. Ms. Meagan Wolfe is the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, serving as the state's chief election official. Meagan was appointed by a bipartisan 6-member commission in February of 2018 and unanimously confirmed by the state Senate in May of 2019 for a 4-year term. Serving as an election security advocate and ambassador for the needs of her clerks and voters remains her highest priority as the state prepares for the 2020 election cycle. A significant part of her job is ensuring that the Wisconsin's 1,922, yes, you heard that right, 1,922 local election officials, the most of any state in the union, have the resources and technology they need to conduct elections. Our other guest is Brigadier General Robyn Blader. Brigadier General Robyn Blader is the Assistant Adjutant General for the Readiness and Training. In this capacity, she assists the Adjutant General and Deputy Adjutant General in sustaining and growing the organizational readiness of the 7,500 soldiers of the Wisconsin Army National Guard in an effort to maintain the defense of the nation and the state of Wisconsin. She is the Wisconsin National Guard's liaison with the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I reached out to Administrator Wolfe a couple of weeks ago when I heard about the use of the National Guard to supplement local election officials and how that process worked. So Meagan, can you talk a little bit about how that process worked, where you requested and obtained the assistance to that, and how you sort of designed this process to work with your local election officials?
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. It's a real honor to be here, especially with General Blader, who was just an absolute pleasure to work with her and her team. It was really an incredible experience through a really challenging time. So I truly don't have enough thanks to offer to our National Guard and to General Blader for all their efforts. How it first started is we have been working as a state agency with the Wisconsin State Emergency Operations Center. So our Emergency Operations Center has seats for all of the agencies that were dealing with the COVID crisis. And as part of that process, we were able to put in sort of a ticket through the system with the Emergency Operations Center to let the overall operations folks know what did we need to support elections. Now, of course, it was very quickly, rapidly evolving for us. We were the only state to have an election that was ongoing when there was the first stay-at-home order in our state. So ballots went out for our April election at the end of February. Our first stay-at-home order was March 12th. And so we were well in the middle of the election when the COVID crisis really came to be in our state. And so through that ticket process, we were able to initiate a team, which I'll let General Blader speak about, to help us figure out what did we need to address this crisis. How could the National Guard and other state resources help to supplement some of the needs that we had with elections? And so it was really a team effort, and General Blader did just a phenomenal job of helping us pull together the resources that we needed to be able to pull off our April 7th election.
So, Brigadier General, could you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how you got the request and how you were able to recruit so many National Guard? It looked like there were 2,400 that served in the April election, and then in a special election following that. From your perspective, how did that process work for you? I believe it's the first in the country. Can you tell me about what your concerns were and how were they addressed, and then how did this work from your perspective?
All right, thank you, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be part of this morning. And I certainly would like to thank Meagan Wolfe too for all of her efforts in collaborating with us and partnering with us as we provided assistance and support to make sure that this mission was a success. So we essentially started off with, after the request for assistance came through our State Emergency Operations Center, with procuring and distributing supplies to make sure that the polling stations could be set up as safely as possible to ensure that our citizens could appear in person and vote, and that we had the polling stations as safe as possible for them. So that was a huge undertaking, trying to get those supplies procured, especially with the demand in the supply system being very challenged at that time, because we had a lot of panic and fear in what this virus was, and everyone was trying to get hand sanitizer, was trying to get personal protection as well too. So those were very, very challenging to procure those in time for the election. And we also had a lot of fear and panic out there in the public. So as far as the next part of it was trying to assist in procuring volunteers so that the elections could take place and the polling stations could open up. And this was something that was very, very challenging, because we really were looking at reaching out among the state to find other volunteers that could replace the vulnerable population, which again is our elderly population that were basically bowing out of serving as volunteers for this election. So we were able to procure through a lot of efforts, and those efforts were reaching out to our communities, whether it be through private organizations such as our local Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs, things like that, just trying to get volunteers, reaching out to our school systems, whether that be the public school systems, private school systems, because we had a lot of schools that were closed, and we were hoping that we could get volunteers that way as well too. Also reaching out to state employees that were working from home, to see if we could get volunteers through our state volunteer pool. Again, numerous organizations, whether it was like the United Way, the Salvation Army, any type of organization that was out there, we were trying to get it, whether it was on a state level, local level, even right down to churches and things like that. But we found as we were filling the volunteer deficit, we were continuing to lose more and more of the volunteers. And we really were in a situation where we've had exhausted everything that we could to recruit volunteers for the election. And so the decision was made to then activate on state active duty the National Guard to work at the polling stations, so that we could have the polling stations open and we could move forward with voting on April 7th. And that process, it was, again, certainly the first for the state of Wisconsin to activate the National Guard to assist with this polling mission. And I believe the first in the nation as well too. And there was a lot of, again, we had exhausted all avenues before that decision was made. And one of the challenges that we had is that you have to be a resident of the county to work at the polling station. So we had to determine where all of our service members resided physically, so that we could pull the service members from the county and get them assigned a polling station within their county. And so within basically 48 hours notice, we activated approximately 2,500 service members throughout the state to assist with that. The Wisconsin Elections Commission had reached out to all of the county clerks throughout the state, requesting their need by county as to how many poll workers they felt that they needed to open up their polling stations within their county. And we use that as our guide to try to fill as many of the requests as what we possibly could. And we were successful in being able to fill the majority of the requests that came in. There was a few of the counties that we weren't able to fill entirely the requests. But again, it was definitely a very complex and challenging mobilization for the state act to bring all of our service members on state active duty, again, because of the short notice that we had, and then also trying to fill in by county where these service members would actually work. Because typically when we activate as a guard, we're activating units together. So it was very decentralized and trying to figure out then how we were gonna have the accountability of all those service members and things out there. And then also the other piece of it was then how were we going to make sure that they were trained as poll workers to work the polling stations. And Meagan Wolfe and her team were instrumental in putting together online training. So as we were bringing on our service members onto state active duty, we had online training that was set up for them. And I think it was approximately about a 3-hour training block that they would go through. And I know there was some skepticism with the county clerks out there that, you know, they'd be responsible for the training and that the service members would not be trained, and it would add a burden onto them to take care of the training and stuff like that. But that worked very, very well. We had very, very positive comments from the county clerks of how well our service members were trained, and that they were so appreciative of that training being completed prior to their arrival in their counties. And again, that was credit to Meagan Wolfe and her team in getting that training and stuff put together, that training package. And we actually used that same training package then for the May 7th congressional election that we had as well too, and that worked very, very well.
Oh, well, that's great. Administrator Wolfe, tell me from your perspective on the training side of it and sort of the recruitment phases that the Brigadier General talked about, and the fact that it really was an emergency, and how you effectuated that training and that deployment of those you know, National Guard members to the appropriate counties in which they live. From your perspective in dealing with the clerks, how did that process work? And, you know, what would you provide that information to other election officials?
Sure. So, you know, it, like you stated, it truly was an emergency situation. You know, that's the Guard's role in a lot of our states and in emergencies, is to step in and help when there truly is an emergency. So this was the result of exhausting, like General Blader said, all other available options. As soon as the crisis became apparent, we did a survey with our local election officials, and we asked them to keep us in the loop about shortages of poll workers in their communities. Again, we operate at the municipal level. Our counties also play a role, and we have 1,850 municipal clerks in our state. And so each city, town, and village, even if they only have, you know, 50 registered voters, they still have to run elections, train and recruit poll workers in that jurisdiction. And so we put out a survey to them right away and asked them to report to us how critical their need for poll workers was. Were they able to open some polling places, but maybe not with the staffing that they had hoped for? Or were they in a critical position where they did not have enough poll workers to even open one polling place? And overall, clerks reported to us more than 7,000 poll workers in terms of a shortage that they did not have to be able to run their polling place in the way that they had planned. And so we did exhaust all of their options. We built widgets on our websites. We put out press release. We did earned in social media. We worked through all state decision makers to try to encourage Wisconsinites to become poll workers. There was so much uncertainty at the time. And so some of our local election officials called recruiting poll workers like trying to hold water in your hands. You know, as soon as you got some in there, you would lose them very, very quickly. And so the process for engaging the National Guard, again, is an emergency. This isn't a situation where you're going to be able to plan months in advance that this is something that you're going to need. We had to exhaust all our other options. And so right before the weekend before the election, we had a call with all our county clerks. So while our county clerks don't run elections necessarily in terms of registering voters and putting together polling places, the 72 counties play a really important role in serving as our conduit from the state to the local level in a lot of ways. And so we got on a call with General Blader and her team, with our 72 county clerks in very short order. And we said, okay, we are still hearing that there's going to be this shortage. We have to make sure that in each of our 1,850 municipalities that they have what they need to at least be able to open up the polls on Tuesday. And how do we do that? And so the 72 counties agreed to serve as sort of those points of contact for deploying those Guard members to the counties. And so the plan kind of worked where on that Friday, we did that webinar with the counties. We let them know how the process was going to work, how the deployment was going to work, how the training would happen. On Saturday, I believe all the Guards members were called on to active duty to report and do their intake and whatnot. And on Sunday, they started doing the training that we had put together. We don't have a role in training poll workers at the state level typically or statutorily. So we had to create a whole slew of training that was online for the Guards members to view and watch because we wanted them to be able to step into any role that was needed in those polling places. So like General Blader said, our law says that most poll workers have to be citizens of the county where they're serving. And so there are some roles where you have to first be trained and go through a certified training process, and you have to be a resident of that county. And so we wanted to make sure they had training so they could fulfill any role that they needed to on election day if it was needed. I think another important part of the plan that I think at first alarms people a little bit, saw how it worked, they felt good about it, and the feedback was truly incredible, is that these were soldiers that were serving in their communities where they live and they work. So these were the voters, neighbors, friends, family, co-workers that they know from their communities serving in plain clothes at the polling places. And so I think, you know, sort of the visual of how that played out was different than maybe how some people had pictured it. And it was really a great effort of the communities coming together and people serving their communities through the National Guard. And so once they received that online training on Sunday, on Monday, then they reported to the municipality or the county where they were going to be serving. So many of the Guards members were appointed to a municipality where we knew that there was a shortage. We knew that they were going to need someone on Tuesday. They reported right there on Monday to start training with that clerk. They already had the baseline of training that we had provided to them, but then they were able to familiarize themselves with the polling place, to help with setup, and to learn a little bit more about the process so that when they reported on Tuesday, that they were familiar with how that clerk ran elections in that jurisdiction. We also had some sort of overflow. I don't think that lasted very long because everybody ended up being deployed or sort of cross-leveled to various jurisdictions that needed them. But we did hope to have sort of a reserve in some counties in case on election morning a jurisdiction reported to us that they weren't able to open, that they had to have a poll worker or two to help them. And we found that was really beneficial too. I still to this day think that the National Guard was responsible for us being able to pull off opening a polling place in all 1,850 municipalities. And it ensured that every single jurisdiction, all 1,850, at least had the basic number of poll workers needed to be able to operate their elections. And so you can see that was a really short time frame where everything came together. And so it's pretty incredible that things were able to happen that quickly and that it resulted in us being able to open all of our polling places on that Tuesday.
Well, that's actually quite amazing, the fact that every polling place was able to open on time, particularly in COVID-19. And we all know that there's often at least a couple that don't open on time. That's amazing, particularly in this environment. Brigadier General, did you want to comment on that? Did you have something?
Yeah, I'll just add on that, you know, essentially our service members had 48 hours notice from the time they got the call that they were going to be doing this mission to the time that they were actually starting the process of coming on to state active duty. And we basically had set this out on over 4 days. So day one, they would start the process of going online, doing the training. And so that was on Sunday. And then on Monday, they actually went out, met with the county clerk in the county. And we wanted to do that so that there was that touch point where they knew that where they needed to report on Tuesday morning for the election itself. And then also to provide any assistance with the county clerks, if there was assistance that needed to be done with setting up the polling stations and things like that, they could assist with that. And then on Monday, they were then released to go back home, and they at least knew then where they needed to report then Tuesday morning for the election and what time that they needed to do. And communication was crucial with that. Having that phone call with all 72 county clerks so we could get everyone all on the same page was crucial. And having basically a standardized report time and standardized thing across the board for all 72 counties was crucial as well too, because we had some clerks, that wanted to have report times at different times and wanted to do things a little bit differently as far as where the service members were going to be reporting and things like that. And we really stressed that it needed to be consistent across the board, because again, we were looking at bringing in 2,500 service members, and if we could keep it as simple as possible, that would certainly make sure that we were successful in meeting their needs that they needed to have here. So we agreed upon a set time for our service members to report. That worked out very, very well. We made sure that we had in advance the actual location, because again, we were dealing with this pandemic, which a lot of these county clerks have small buildings where they're working out of, and we had to take into account that, we may not be able to have, if they had 100 service members or more showing up, we had to keep in mind the social distancing and things like that for our service members as well too. So we had to come up with locations of where they could report to, again, meet that clerk, get the information that they needed from the clerk, and then be dispatched out to where they were going to be working. So we needed to keep in mind that we had all these guidelines that were put out by the CDC that we needed to be making sure that we were implementing as well too, as we were doing this activation and going out to the counties themselves as well. And then again, making sure we had that messaging out there, because we needed to make sure that the county clerks were very clear that we were not showing up in uniforms, that we were showing up on state active duty, and that everyone would basically be dressed in business casual, and that these individuals that were coming out to their counties were again friends, family, neighbors, co-workers within the communities. And again, making sure we had that messaging put out there, because I think there was a perception that we were going to be showing up in our uniforms, and we were guard members from that they didn't know, and things like that. So that was very, very important to get that message out there to everyone.
So let's shift a little bit and just describe from both your perspectives what the National Guard members were able to do on election day in the polling places, and how they were able to help the clerks. And then perhaps the feedback from local election officials, the clerks, and maybe the Brigadier General could talk about the feedback that we received from the members themselves on the experience, whether or not they felt it was positive, and whether they would do it again. So what were they actually doing on election day generally, and then what was the feedback? Why don't we start with you, Meagan?
Sure. So on election day itself, the Guards members would have been serving as poll workers, just like you would see in any other roles. So some of them were serving in roles such as helping to make sure that all voters were offered sanitizer, or wiping down surfaces or voting equipment between voters. So some of them may have played that role. Others may have been helping with line management, making sure that social distancing was being accomplished, helping people as they read the screeners before they entered the building, all sorts of roles that any other poll worker would be taking on during the COVID crisis as well. And they were also trained in other aspects such as voter registration, just helping with general setup, all the various duties. Now in most polling places, it was reported to us that they did have poll workers that were more experienced, perhaps, that were serving in some of those more complex areas such as voter registration and other things, but they did have training in those areas. They were able to step in and fill any gaps that were needed because we did make sure that they got training and certification to be able to fulfill any role that was needed. Some of them were even kind enough to stay through Tuesday and come back on Wednesday to help the clerks with some of the other post-election tasks that happen, tearing down of the polling places, sanitation of the facilities. They were incredibly gracious, and the feedback that we received from our clerks is, it's still, it gives me goosebumps to even think about, because our clerks felt so supported. It was certainly the most challenging thing I've ever been through in my career, and I think a lot of our clerks would say the same. It was a really difficult time, and we were doing the best we could with limited pool of resources, and they literally felt like the cavalry came, that they were supported, that someone came there to make sure that we were able to run elections. And so they all reported that the Guards members were incredibly courteous and kind, and were so helpful in making sure that the polling place was able to open and that voters were serviced the best they possibly could. So the feedback couldn't have been better from our local election officials and our voters in terms of those experiences. Voters didn't realize that there were National Guard members at a lot of their polling places because they couldn't differentiate them from other poll workers. But the clerks that knew sort of who those new poll workers were reported that it was just an incredible experience, and they felt very, very supported.
Brigadier General.
All right, thank you. So it was really important that we had the training for each of our service members so that they could do whatever role that they were placed in on election day. And that was crucial. And again, Meagan, Wolfe, and her team did a phenomenal job in making sure that our service members were trained for whatever mission that they were going to be put in. Because again, each polling location had different requirements of where they needed to have the workers and things like that. So that was crucial, making sure that they could assume any role that was needed on election day. And as far as the response that we received from the county clerks after the election, I can tell you my email was blowing up on Wednesday morning. I've never ever seen such appreciation and so many emails coming in with just positive responses. And one of the things that stood out for me is one of the responses that we got from one of the county clerks was, she went on to say how stressful this was planning for that. And she said the smoothest part of this election was the National Guard. So that was very, very heartwarming to hear that, that was the smoothest part for her in the election. Because again, I mean, the clerks were under a tremendous amount of stress because we had the pandemic that, and there were so many unknowns and so much fear that was going rampant throughout the state. And they again didn't know up until probably the day before whether the election was even going to be occurring or not. And again, it was just a lot of chaos. But we, Meagan Wolfe and her team, as well as the service members, we kept focused that, hey, we need to keep planning forward as the election is going to occur, and I'm glad that we did that because it made for the success of this happening. And again, like I said, they had so many positive responses of how well that our service members worked for them. I mean, they talked about how they took the initiative to do things that they didn't even ask them to do. That they stayed late into the evening to assist with ballot counting, and did whatever that they were asked to do, and were very professional and very, very, very polite with community members and the other poll workers and things. So again, very, very positive comments and responses that we've received from service members themselves. We have had a lot of positive responses. They thought it was a great opportunity to get out in their communities. Matter of fact, some of our service members were working with family members in their community. We're working with their neighbors. We're working with co-workers in their communities. And it was a great opportunity for them to do that. And we've had a lot of them say that, even in future elections that they will consider actually volunteering to work as poll workers. So hopefully this has been a great recruiting tool for Meagan Wolfe and hopefully in future elections we'll have some of our service members that are actually volunteering in our communities. And again, it was a great learning experience for our service members as well too, to learn the election process and things as well too.
Well, that's great to hear. One of my final questions, and maybe the final question, is sort of what recommendations, since you've been through this experience, anticipate potential, reduction in poll workers that are available? And what is the possibility of using the National Guard again in the general election? Are you going to sort of wait and see, go through that same process again, or what are some of your thoughts? So generally, what are your recommendations to others? And then what are your thoughts about November and potentially using the National Guard to help? We'll start with Meagan again.
Sure. I think my number one recommendation would be to build relationships with your National Guard, with your Emergency Operations Center, to make sure that you know how to communicate with one another in the event of an emergency. Again, one of the things we try to reinforce with our clerks is that the Guard is there to step in to help us in an emergency. As we head into November, we should be exhausting all other channels before we sort of put that burden on our state to utilize the Guard. But that being said, it certainly is good to know that they're there and able to assist us if there were some kind of crisis again as we head into the fall. So I think building those relationships, talking about what you would do in those emergencies is really important. And in our state, we've been very fortunate to have some incredible relationships with our state partners. And so I think when this came about, we already had some very well-established connections. We knew who to talk to. Our Emergency Operations Center had a seat for us. So make sure that, if there is a crisis in your state, that you've got a seat at the table with the decision makers, that you know who to talk to make sure that all these things can happen very quickly if they need to. And so, we hope that we don't have to go through an emergency like this in the future, but we certainly will plan accordingly in case we do have to utilize those options in the future as well. And as General Blader said, I think we learned a lot about how to better coordinate and communicate in an emergency like this in the future. So I think we were able to refine our process even between April and May in terms of how that deployment, education, all of those pieces worked. So the more you can do to plan for the worst, hope for the best, I think is really important as states head into the fall. Hope that you don't have to utilize these emergency options, but know how you would in the event that it arises as well. In terms of November, I guess, that's to be seen. We also have an August statewide election. So it seems like every time you turn the corner, we've got another election here in our states. So we're preparing right now for our August statewide election. And, again, we'll keep working with our clerks, working with our partners at the state and with the National Guard to make sure that we have a plan. We're working actually really closely with them. One of the things I think we kind of brushed over a little bit is working on distribution of supplies. The Guard was so instrumental in that as well. And that's something that we are working on right now for our August and November elections, is procuring all the supplies for the localities to make sure that they have hand sanitizer, that they have PPE, even things like blue painter's tape. We found it was hard for us to find enough for all our polling places so they could mark 6-foot distances in the lines so that they could hang some of the COVID and social distancing related signs. So working to get all of those supplies, working to make sure we have enough, and then distributing them. The Guard has played a critical role in that distribution to our local election officials to ensure that they have access to the supplies that they need, especially in a decentralized state like ours. Getting all those supplies to all of the polling places in each of the 1,850 municipalities was a real challenge. And so that's something we're working on with them right now because we do have the luxury of a little more time heading into August and November. We want to make sure we get them all the supplies that they need for both August and November. So when they're training their poll workers, when they're preparing their voters, they're able to say definitively, I have the supplies that I need to be able to administer a safe in-person election if that's the option that a voter chooses. And so that's probably one of the main things we're working with the Guard on right now is how do we get those supplies, and then how do we get them out to all of our local election officials so that they know and can feel good about the fact that they have the supplies that they need to be able to move into the August and November elections.
Brigadier General, how are you preparing for the next election or the general election, and with regards to PPE and potentially being asked to be poll workers?
So at this point in time, we do not have a request for assistance for volunteers. Again, we'll have to go through and exhaust all of the avenues first before that would occur. Again, working on trying to procure volunteers through whatever means that is, through social media means, through volunteer organizations, private organizations, things like that, and hopefully the fear level is tapered down. Hopefully we're going to have more poll workers for the upcoming elections. You know, and we've also had 2 elections now where I think people have gone through and seen that it can be done safely. I mean, we work very closely with our Department of Health Services to establish guidelines for polling stations so that they could be safely set up. And again, I think the public has a much better appreciation that voting can occur safely. We've had a number of comments where people have said that, you know, they felt safer, you know, going to the polling station than they did going to the local grocery store because of the measures and things that were set up. So we anticipate that we are going to be, I know Meagan and her team are putting together a survey, and communication is crucial with those county clerks to find out what their needs are. So I understand there is going to be a request coming in for, again, the procurement and distribution of supplies that the Guard will be assisting them in again, procuring and distributing that all out there. And again, the distribution piece, as Meagan indicated, wasn't talked about very much, but it was a huge piece here. You know, the Wisconsin Election Commission team getting out a survey as early as possible to find out what those needs were. And we basically, you know, looked at hand sanitizer, we looked at, you know, isopropyl wipes for machines, we looked at, you know, pens, we looked at personal protective equipment. Those were the type of supplies that we were procuring, and tape for the social distancing, and they put together the signage and things like that to put up in the polling stations. But that was a huge muscle movement, not only procuring all of those supplies, and again, on very, very stressed supply chains, but also then once we had all those supplies, you know, where are they going to show up at, and then how are you going to break all those supplies down so that it actually gets broke down by county as to what everyone needs. And then it's getting all those supplies pushed out to all 72 counties from there. And then, you know, how do we set up the times and the location for those supplies to be picked up? So again, that was a huge, huge muscle movement, and it will be a huge muscle movement for the upcoming elections as well too, but at least we have time on our side. So any advice that I could give, again, is just the communication that Meagan talked about. We definitely need to make sure that, you know, the clerks know early on what their needs are going to be, and trying to make that decision as soon as possible as to whether, you know, the Guard is going to be requested to fill in the gap for the volunteers that are needed. Because again, the more time that we can have, it'll make it much easier for us to, but again, we've been through this twice already, so I think we've got the process down. But again, we refined it quite a bit from the April election on things that we learned on how to do the communication piece a little bit better, so we have a better command and control of our service members. We actually stood up a command and control officer that was in charge of ensuring that we had full accountability of our service members throughout the state, and we had service members then reporting up, and that worked out very well in the May election. So that was an improvement that we had made. We'll, again, if we get called to assist in either the August or November elections, we'll certainly implement again as well too. And again, as I indicated, that distribution and procurement of supplies was a huge piece. And I would certainly encourage, you know, the other states that are looking at utilizing the Guard, you know, that is an area that they could have the Guard assist them with if they're not able to get the supplies procured on their own and distributed on their own after exhausting their avenues.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for, you know, the partnership and allowing voters to vote in a secure and safe manner for those elections, and I'm sure in the future as well. Before we wrap this up, is there any last advice or things that I just didn't ask the question on what was a great service, I think, for the last couple of elections? We'll start with Meagan. Was there anything else as we wrap this up that you'd like to share with other local or state election officials on this partnership?
You know, I think, again, just anything you can do to establish those lines of communication and develop those partnerships. We can't do it alone. And so I think making sure that you recognize that right away as election administrators, that, you know, we have, hopefully all states are as lucky as we are. We have this wealth of expertise and of people that are there to support some of these efforts. Engage them as soon as you can to make sure that you're leveraging all of the relationships that are out there in the support systems that you may have in your state. There are going to be uncertainties as we head into the fall. There's no doubt about that. And we're going to have to be able to adjust and change at the last minute. As General Blader said, we didn't know in the hours before the election if there were going to be additional court interventions or what might happen in terms of our election even happening. And so all of those things are going to probably be certainties of our fall election cycle. And so making sure that we're prepared for those things and making sure that we know who to talk to, we have those relationships is, I think, going to be just incredibly critical. And, you know, again, I can't thank our National Guard and General Blader enough for their service to our country, our state, our communities. It was just such an incredibly heartwarming effort in a very difficult time to see everybody be able to come together and support our democracy. So just a huge thank you again to you.
General Blader, any last words before we wrap this up?
Yeah, in closing, I guess I would just recommend that the planning for the November elections, you know, start early because there needs to be those contacts with whether it's the public health officials and getting guidance as to how they can safely set up their polling stations. You know, that's stuff that they can start implementing now, and, you know, that guidance may change as you get closer to the election, but at least if they can kind of have a template for that put together, I think that would certainly be very helpful. Again, communicating with all of the county clerks to find out what their needs are for supplies and things like that. Because again, supply chains are definitely stressed. And I think the sooner they can start that process to determine what they're going to need for supplies, for hand sanitizer, you know, personal protective equipment, things like that. I don't think they can start planning that soon enough. And then also just trying to figure out, you know, what their needs are going to be, you know, making sure that they're going to have enough volunteers. And again, that is a moving target as you get closer and closer to the election, as we've seen here in Wisconsin. You know, we had numbers on one day and the next day they were changing as more and more people were dropping out and stuff like that. And that proved to be very challenging. And there was a lot of work put in by the Wisconsin Election Commission, you know, trying to make sure that we were filling those gaps where we could, to make sure that we could actually open the polling stations. And it was truly a pleasure and an honor for our service members to be part of this election process. They got a lot out of it. It was a great opportunity for them to be serving their community and their state. And we certainly are looking forward to working with the Wisconsin Election Commission again and partnering with them to assist and support in any way that we can in our upcoming August and November elections.
Well, thank you both for doing this Zoom interview. And I hope that, and I believe that state and local election officials will appreciate it. With that, we're going to conclude the Zoom. Thank you very much, and good luck in August and November.
Thank you.